May 1943, northern Tunisia. The desert is finally quiet. For months, this land had thundered with the roar of engines and artillery, the echo of Rommel's retreat and the relentless pursuit of the Allies. Now only the wind moves across the dunes, carrying the smell of oil, dust, and something far more human, the remnants of war. Convoys of American trucks roll through the heat haze, their olive-drab silhouettes shimmering against a scorched horizon. Among the prisoners they carry are not soldiers but nurses, women of the German Afrika Korps medical service. Their white armbands, once symbols of mercy, are now folded tight against sunburned skin. They expect harshness. They expect hatred. Propaganda had warned them. Surrender meant humiliation, cruelty, perhaps death. But when the convoy stops at a U.S. field hospital, they see something else. Doctors and medics, young Americans hardened by the same war, moving calmly, treating German and American wounded side by side. The nurses exchange uneasy glances. Everything they'd been told is about to be tested. The war in North Africa is ending. But for them, a new understanding is about to begin. North Africa had been a proving ground, a brutal classroom where both sides learned the realities of modern war. When German and Italian troops first landed in 1941, under the command of General Erwin Rommel, their mission seemed simple: rescue their collapsing Italian allies and push the British out of Libya. Yet the vast desert turned into a labyrinth of attrition. Distances were endless, supplies uncertain, and the environment more lethal than any enemy. For the Afrika Korps, logistics became a nightmare. Fuel, water, and medical equipment had to cross the Mediterranean under constant Allied attack. Hospitals were makeshift. Tents converted farmhouses, even shaded gullies in the sand. Nurses of the German Red Cross and the Wehrmacht's medical corps worked with minimal tools: field dressings, sulfa powder, morphine when available, and faith when nothing else remained. They treated shattered limbs, burns from exploding tanks, and the endless tide of dysentery and infection. For many, the desert's sun felt as deadly as the bullets. As Rommel's reputation grew, so did the myth of the Gentleman's War, a campaign often remembered for its chivalry compared to Europe's brutality. Prisoners were exchanged, medics respected, and hospitals often spared bombardment when marked clearly with red crosses. But this fragile code of honor began to unravel after the Second Battle of El Alamein in late 1942. British and Commonwealth forces, under General Bernard Montgomery, broke through at last. Operation Torch soon followed, the Allied landings in French North Africa. Now caught between two Allied armies, Rommel's forces faced the impossible. Retreat became the only strategy. Through Tripoli, through the desert towns of Merith and Gabes, through sandstorms that blinded entire convoys. Medical columns moved with the rear guard, nurses treating the wounded in trucks bouncing over rock and dust. By early 1943, the German Afrika Korps was cornered in Tunisia. Supplies had vanished. Food was scarce. Typhus and malaria stalked the camps. Still, the nurses worked, setting broken bones with scavenged splints, sterilizing instruments over campfires, writing last letters for men they knew would never leave. In the distance, the sound of American artillery grew louder each day, and behind those guns came something new: an army with modern logistics, abundant medical supplies, and a doctrine that saw compassion not as weakness, but as duty. The two worlds were about to meet. By the spring of 1943, the Axis line in Tunisia was breaking apart. The last holdouts, German and Italian divisions stretched across the ridges near Tunis and Bizerte, faced overwhelming Allied firepower. The desert sky, once the domain of the Luftwaffe, now belonged to Allied bombers. The thunder of artillery rolled from dawn to dusk. Among the Allied forces pressing forward were the Americans of the II Corps, men who had suffered a harsh baptism of fire at Kasserine Pass only weeks earlier. That defeat had shaken them deeply, but under new leadership, reinforced with experience and discipline, they returned stronger, determined to prove themselves. Behind their armored thrusts came the U.S. Army Medical Department, an often overlooked corps that moved with precision and efficiency. Mobile field hospitals marked with the Red Cross followed the advance. Evacuation chains stretched from frontline aid stations to surgical tents to fully equipped general hospitals along the coast. Every soldier, friend or foe, who fell within their reach would be treated. That was not a courtesy, it was the law. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, medics were to render care without discrimination. The American military command, determined to uphold that standard, made it clear German or Italian wounded were to receive the same attention as Allied troops. And so, when the Axis lines collapsed and the first large groups of prisoners began to flow in, American doctors and nurses faced an unusual sight. Captured German medical units, still wearing their armbands, arriving with their own wounded. At first, there was tension. German nurses stood stiff and silent beside the stretchers, waiting for orders. They expected ridicule, perhaps punishment. Many had been told by Nazi propaganda that Americans were barbarians who mutilated prisoners. But the Americans offered water, bandages, cigarettes, clean sheets. Some even thanked the German medics for their help during triage. In the heat and chaos of surrender, a rare kind of order emerged, one guided by the universal language of medicine. By early May, Axis resistance ended. More than 250,000 German and Italian troops were captured, an entire army, vanishing into Allied custody. Among them were hundreds of medical staff, doctors, orderlies, and nearly 200 nurses from the Afrika Korps. They were exhausted, sunburned, and emotionally broken, ready for judgment. Instead, what awaited them was not vengeance but an unexpected mercy that would leave them forever changed. For the German nurses captured in Tunisia, surrender was not a single moment. It was a slow unraveling of belief. Many had volunteered out of duty or ideology, raised in a Germany that told them service was sacrifice and obedience was honor. They had marched beneath the swastika, sworn oaths to the Führer, and followed Rommel's army into the desert believing they served a noble cause. But after months of treating shattered bodies and burying men in sandstorms, conviction gave way to exhaustion. They had seen the Afrika Korps wither, starved, wounded, retreating endlessly. By May 1943, what remained of their faith in victory had dried up like the desert itself. When captured, fear took hold. Rumors spread through the prisoners' ranks. Americans would humiliate them, force them into hard labor, or worse. The women braced for hostility. They clung to discipline, straight backs, crisp uniforms, eyes averted. Then came the shock. The Americans were polite, efficient. Doctors gave instructions in calm tones. Wounded German soldiers were placed on clean cots. Some were even anesthetized for surgery, a level of care the Afrika Korps hadn't seen in months. The nurses watched silently as the procedures unfolded. They recognized familiar instruments, scalpels, clamps, but the abundance of supplies astonished them. Where their units had used rags for bandages, here crates of sterile gauze sat stacked like ammunition. The air smelled of disinfectant, not dust and decay. One American medic, writing in his diary, noted, "The German nurses looked terrified. When they saw we treated their wounded, they started to help us. Language didn't matter. Medicine did." For the first time in years, these women were surrounded not by soldiers demanding sacrifice, but by doctors practicing compassion. It was disorienting, almost unbelievable. Some wept quietly while cleaning wounds. Others refused food at first, thinking it a trick. But within days, fear softened. Duty returned, not to ideology but to humanity. The war had taught them to expect only cruelty. Now they were being shown mercy. American battlefield medicine in North Africa represented a revolution in military care. The U.S. Army had studied the grim lessons of World War I and built a chain of survival unlike anything the Germans had encountered. Each division had forward aid stations within yards of the front line. Wounded men were stabilized, tagged, and evacuated by jeep or ambulance to mobile surgical hospitals, the prototype of what would later become the MASH units of Korea. To the captured nurses, it felt like stepping into another world. For the American Medical Corps, the treatment of enemy wounded was not merely compliance with international law, it was a matter of moral discipline. Colonel Charles B. Spruitt, a senior U.S. Army medical officer in Tunisia, wrote in a field memorandum, "Every wounded man is a human being first. The uniform he wears must never change that." This philosophy spread quickly through American hospitals and aid stations. Commanders reinforced it constantly. Medics were soldiers without enemies. The Red Cross on their sleeves was a promise to heal without hatred. This code created an environment of quiet dignity, even amid the chaos of mass surrender. German doctors were allowed to assist their wounded under American supervision. Nurses, though technically prisoners, were permitted to help in wards, their professionalism recognized rather than dismissed. The Geneva Convention was more than a rulebook here. It was a moral line that set the tone for what came next. In these tents of canvas and dust, compassion became an act of quiet defiance against the cruelty that had engulfed Europe. The Americans' attitude shocked many German prisoners. Years of propaganda had painted the Allies as decadent and inhuman. Yet in Tunisia, those same enemies offered medical care to their captives with patience and respect. For some American doctors, the sight of German nurses still tending to their wounded even as their army surrendered inspired admiration. They did not abandon their patients, one report noted. Even when their cause was lost, they kept working. In those words was a recognition of something universal, that in war, the profession of healing transcended allegiance. From the testimonies gathered after the war, several German nurses recalled their disbelief at how they were treated. One wrote in a post-war account preserved in German archives, "We were certain they would hate us. Instead, they gave us food, medicine, and rest. I could not understand it. They treated our wounded like their own." Others described how American doctors asked them to assist in surgeries, respecting their skill. For women who had spent years under an ideology that valued obedience over compassion, this equality was profoundly moving. Through that unexpected cooperation, stereotypes dissolved. The enemy became human again. And in those desert hospitals and built for war but sustained by mercy, the first fragile bridge of understanding between two worlds began to form. The war in North Africa ended not with a single explosion, but with silence. On May 13, 1943, the Axis High Command in Tunisia formally surrendered. More than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms, the largest mass capitulation of Axis forces until the final days of the war. Across the countryside, columns of prisoners trudged toward Allied collection points. The once mighty Afrika Korps, Rommel's Ghost Division, was gone. In the midst of this human tide, a small group of German nurses remained at a bomb-scarred field hospital outside Bizerte. For weeks they had worked around the clock, treating the remnants of shattered divisions. Now they stood among stretchers and sandbags watching American vehicles approach through the shimmering heat. White flags fluttered weakly above the tents. A young U.S. medical officer stepped out, his uniform coated with dust. Behind him, orderlies unloaded supplies, morphine, plasma, fresh bandages. No one fired a shot. The Germans lowered their heads, expecting arrest or contempt. Instead, the Americans moved straight to the patients. They didn't speak much, just gestures, short commands, the universal rhythm of triage. Within minutes, the nurses realized what was happening. The Americans weren't seizing the hospital. They were taking over care. One of the nurses, later interviewed by the Red Cross, remembered that moment vividly. They came not as conquerors, but as doctors. We were confused. We had been told they were savages, but they treated our wounded before their own paperwork. In that first hour, the barriers of ideology began to crumble. German and American medics worked shoulder to shoulder under the Tunisian sun. Instruments were shared, techniques exchanged, and for the first time the German nurses saw the scale of Allied medical organization. Refrigeration units for plasma, portable X-rays, sterilizers powered by generators. For women who had performed surgery by lantern light, it was staggering. Yet what struck them more than the technology was the attitude. The Americans spoke with a calm professionalism that disarmed fear. They offered the nurses water, then asked, through broken German and hand signals, for their help in treating the wounded. Hours passed. The desert wind blew through the canvas walls of the operating tent. Two armies, once locked in mortal combat, were now bound by a shared mission: to keep men alive. And as daylight faded, the impossible had already begun. Enemies healing one another. As night settled over the Tunisian camp, the temperature dropped sharply. The heat of the day gave way to a cold wind that hissed through the olive groves. Lanterns glowed inside the medical tents, their flickering light casting long shadows across rows of stretchers. Inside one of those tents, a quiet miracle of cooperation continued. German nurses and American doctors worked side by side. The air smelled of antiseptic and sweat. Somewhere outside, the faint crackle of a radio carried the news. The Afrika Korps had ceased to exist. But here, in the fragile bubble of the hospital, war was suspended. One American surgeon, Captain James Walker, later wrote, "We operated all night. It didn't matter who they were, German, Italian, or ours. The nurses helped without hesitation. I never saw such endurance." Those words captured the transformation unfolding before him. The German nurses, who hours earlier had stood rigid with fear, now moved with instinctive purpose. They handed instruments, cleaned wounds, monitored vital signs. One translated German medical terms to help the Americans read field notes on the wounded. Another held the hand of a dying soldier, not asking whether he was Allied or Axis. Even the American medics, hardened by months of battle, were moved by the professionalism of their former enemies. Some admitted later that they had underestimated the German nurses on seeing not the enemy but fellow healers trapped in the same tragedy. A Red Cross observer visiting days later described the scene as a rare example of human decency untouched by ideology. The nurses themselves found the experience disorienting. Many had spent years under strict propaganda that dehumanized the Allies. To witness those same men offering food, blankets, and equal treatment challenged everything they'd believed. One nurse later recalled, "It was as if the world turned upside down. We had lost the war, but we found our humanity." By the end of that week, dozens of wounded, German and American alike, were alive because of that cooperation. When orders came for the German medical personnel to be transported to prisoner camps, many of the American staff volunteered to accompany them, ensuring their safety and continued medical support. For a brief moment, in that sun-scorched corner of Tunisia, compassion triumphed over conflict. And as the nurses boarded the trucks heading north toward captivity, they carried not just the weight of defeat, but the memory of mercy that would haunt them for years to come. The war in North Africa was over. For the Allied forces, victory in Tunisia opened the door to Sicily, to Italy, and ultimately to Europe itself. But for the captured Axis soldiers, and especially the German nurses, it marked the beginning of another quieter journey. Under armed escort, the medical personnel were transported to temporary camps near Ferryville, and later to established prisoner-of-war facilities in Algeria and Morocco. For most, the journey was surreal. The fighting had ended abruptly, and now they rode in American trucks through landscapes littered with the wreckage of their own army, burned-out half-tracks, shattered artillery, empty water tins scattered across the sand. When they arrived, the prisoners were registered, deloused and medically examined by the same U.S. Army doctors who had treated their wounded days earlier. The nurses were separated from the general POW population and assigned to assist in Allied hospitals, still wearing their German uniforms but marked clearly as prisoners under the Geneva Convention. What shocked them most was the treatment they received. They were given clean quarters, proper rations, and access to medical supplies. Red Cross representatives visited regularly, verifying conditions and forwarding letters home through neutral Switzerland reports from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Later noted that the American facilities in North Africa were among the best maintained of the war. Prisoners had access to libraries, recreation, and even classes organized by officers. But for the captured nurses, it was the moral contrast that stayed with them, the feeling of being treated not as criminals, but as human beings. One German nurse later wrote in her post-war memoir, "We had expected revenge. Instead, they gave us dignity. We could not understand it." Meanwhile, American medical staff recorded similar sentiments. In one field hospital diary, a young American nurse wrote, "They looked so tired, so lost. We could not hate them." Perhaps that is what mercy really means. Though the guns had fallen silent, the work of healing continued, German nurses aiding American doctors, both tending to the remnants of a campaign that had consumed tens of thousands of lives. In a war defined by cruelty, this corner of North Africa had become an unlikely sanctuary of decency. In the months that followed the surrender, the captured nurses became part of an extraordinary wartime experiment, a living example of how compassion could survive even within the machinery of global conflict. At American-run POW hospitals in North Africa, their skill and discipline proved invaluable. The U.S. Army Medical Corps, short on experienced nursing staff, often permitted the German nurses to assist under supervision. They prepared operating rooms, sterilized instruments, and cared for both Allied and Axis wounded. What had begun as a necessity evolved into cooperation. Reports from Red Cross inspectors praised their professional competence and noted that relations between the German nurses and American staff remained respectful and humane. Some of the nurses later said that this experience changed their perception of the war entirely. They had seen American soldiers, whom they had been told were monsters, risk infection and exhaustion to save German lives. They had watched doctors pause to comfort dying enemies. One remembered the moment she realized that the enemy's kindness was genuine. An American doctor gave me chocolate because he said I looked pale. I wanted to refuse one, but he smiled and said, "Medicine comes in many forms." I never forgot that. By late 1944, most of the nurses had been transferred to POW camps in the United States, where they worked in medical wards for other prisoners. Their treatment remained consistent, humane, structured and monitored by the Red Cross. For many, the captivity lasted until 1946, long after Germany's surrender. When they finally returned home, they found their homeland in ruins. Yet the stories they carried from Tunisia spread quietly among post-war nursing schools and humanitarian organizations. Several later joined international relief efforts. The same women who had once served under the Nazi banner now dedicating their lives to neutral, compassionate care. Historians examining these events often described the North African campaign as the last front of decency in the Second World War, a place where the chaos of total war was tempered by the fading traditions of honor and the shared ethics of medicine. For those German nurses, the memory of American compassion endured far longer than the war itself. They had entered captivity expecting vengeance. They left it believing in humanity. In the end, the deserts of Tunisia became more than a battlefield. They became a mirror, reflecting not just the futility of war but the endurance of human decency within it. Among the wreckage of tanks and broken armies, the smallest gestures carried the greatest weight. A clean bandage, a shared meal, a hand extended without hatred. These moments did not change the course of the war, but they changed the people who lived them. For the American doctors and medics, it was a reminder that their duty extended beyond victory. For the captured German nurses, it shattered the illusion that compassion belonged only to one side. In a conflict defined by ideology and cruelty, they had glimpsed something older and deeper, a universal instinct to heal. Many of those women never forgot Tunisia. Decades later, when interviewed in nursing journals and oral histories, they spoke not of battles or uniforms, but of faces, of Americans who treated them as equals, of wounded men whose lives were saved by their former enemies. History often remembers North Africa for Rommel's maneuvers, for Patton's rise, for the logistics that shaped later victories, but hidden within that vast campaign was a quieter triumph, one measured not in ground gained or lives lost, but in compassion freely given. The guns fell silent, the sand reclaimed the trenches, and the world moved on. Yet somewhere in those endless dunes, the spirit of that field hospital remains, a small oasis of mercy in a desert of war.